Let's return now to our story of Pope Francis, who is visiting Belgium, taking a message of peace and reconciliation, of course. He'll be talking about the migrant issue, he'll be talking about the war in Ukraine, but also he'll be meeting with victims of those people who are abused by Catholic priests. Some of this, of course, is very historical, but nonetheless, people have survived and still had to live with years of torment over what happened to them at the hands of people who really they should have been able to trust. Let's bring in Marc Artzrouni, who is from the SNAP organisation, that's Survival Network for Those Abused by Priests. Mark is the European coordinator of the group. Mark, thanks for being with us. The scale of abuse within the Catholic Church continues to shock people, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me. And I have to say that our first thoughts must really go to victims of clergy sex abuse around the world who have suffered through a very traumatic experience that is often underplayed by the church. And there's been some rather ghastly cases in Belgium in the last 10 or 20 years. We can go into more detail if you want to.
Please do, because I'll get my cards on the table. I was brought up in a Catholic family, christened as a Catholic. I'm not here to make any excuses or say, well, all I'm saying is that it never fails to shock me how this happens, how it went ignored, how it was brushed over, glossed over. And it's the opposite to my own experience of Catholic priests. But nonetheless, it makes it all the more shocking for me to hear about this. I can't begin to imagine how the victims feel.
Well, you're absolutely right. And you're right to also point out not every single child is going to be abused by a priest in the Catholic school, that's for sure. But the scale of the problem is still pretty horrendous worldwide. And since we're talking about Belgium, let me tell you about the biggest scandal in the last 10, 15 years is with one Bishop Roger van Gilhoeven, who was defrocked earlier this year after admitting 14 years ago that for years he sexually abused a nephew, starting when the nephew was 5 years old. He was given a free pass for 15 years, and only now he was defrocked, probably in the run-up to the visit of the Pope.
As you're giving us these details, I need to point out to people that the person we're seeing there is, of course, Pope Francis. There's no allegation or doubt about him. And, of course, you are detailing things for us that have been historical. I'm just clarifying things for people watching who may be a little bit confused by our use of images. That's why I'm interrupting, just to say that.
Okay, that's fine.
I mean, this visit by Pope Francis, he's going to sit down and what can he say to the victims? How can you begin to ease the pain they are feeling?
Well, that's a good point, and I think what the Pope should do is take the victims seriously, with serious meetings with these victims. And in the present case, I have it on good authority that often in these cases where the Pope meets survivors, the survivors are carefully screened. I understand this is what's going to happen in Belgium, where the meeting on Friday night will take place in a secret location, and what is often the case, probably with minimal media coverage. And that's a shame. And unfortunately, it reflects pretty badly on the Catholic Church when they have these meetings, as I say, partly in secret, which, as a result of which, one can fear that these meetings are for show and do the Church no good. It just continues the crisis and the lack of transparency and lack of trust in the institution.
Indeed. I've got to ask you the question, because it's a question everybody asks, I think, is how did this go on for so long? Because I mean, I've covered this story in many different places, many different times, and it all comes down to the same thing. It's an abuse of power, it's an abuse of responsibility and a massive abuse of trust, but it went covered up. How did that happen?
It's covered up because they're just really, really good at covering it up and making the problems disappear, intimidating the survivors and protecting the perpetrators. That's the recipe for their sort of tragic success. That survivors are intimidated and everything is done to discourage them. I'll give you an example in Belgium where an archbishop in charge of overseeing this case I mentioned about tried to talk the victim into not reporting the abusive bishop who had abused him for years and years. And that's, public knowledge, if you like, that they do everything they can to intimidate victims, and they make the problems disappear. And I mean, I'll give you an example very briefly of a problem that they're pretty good at having disappear. I mentioned Bishop Roger van Gilhoeven, but there's a less well-known case, but very recent, ongoing in Belgium, is a case of Andre Omeonga, a Congolese priest who was credibly accused of holding an underage girl in sexual slavery in the Congo. Well, you may wonder, what does that have to do with Belgium? Remember, old colonial ties? So he fled prosecution. He went to Belgium, where he became a priest for many years. I have all the evidence. Until a few weeks ago, when he was apparently sent back to Congo, perhaps not a coincidence, just before the Pope's visit. And they tend to do that to protect their own, as I say in this case, a criminal who just, found refuge in Belgium for years and years and has escaped prosecution for rather horrendous crime. This shows that the Church is very good at aggressively protecting its own when they are accused of truly horrendous crimes.
Indeed, Mark, without going into the cases you just brought up, the whole thing is an absolute disgrace. It's terrible that people have been abused in this way. Often it's children, and that is just inexcusable. And it continues to shock me, I must admit. I mean, when I see these things, I just feel awful about it, the whole thing. And it's a betrayal of the victims, but then, of course, take it even further, all those who've put faith in the Church over the years. It shakes their faith in it as well, and it's a really horrible thing. So the Pope, perhaps doing the good thing in going to see people, and it's important that there's more people like Pope Francis, I suppose, to show that people of faith do good things and can be trusted. Mark, we need to leave it there. Thank you for joining us, Marc Artzrouni from the Survival Network for those abused by priests. Thanks for joining us. We'll continue to cover the Pope's visit to Belgium. Before I leave you, let's take a look at the situation in Florida, where Hurricane Helene, as you can see here by these images, the camera, which is the remote camera, is shaking. Winds of 250 kilometers per hour hitting land here in Florida. You can see the water being pushed onto the motorway. I'll leave you with that. Do stay with us. Short break, Iron Africa next.